What I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our first panel, essentially, in the presentation of the report itself. And I will introduce Lenny Mendoza, who is a director of McKinsey and a CED trustee.
Let me first also express my appreciation and our collective gratitude to CED, and particularly Steve, as he's the new CEO of the Committee for Economic Development, and Mike Petro and Amy Morse for helping convening and orchestrate this important conversation, and more broadly for the important work that CED does to promote reasoned solutions for difficult problems facing our country in the nation's interest broadly. Having done this since the initiation of the Marshall Plan after World War II, CED has a rich history in doing this, and we're pleased to be here with CED's invitation today, so thank you, Steve. We're delighted that you could all join us today for this new report from our colleagues at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey's business and economic research arm, or think tank, if you will. At McKinsey, we've been thinking about the challenges facing the United States for a long time. About 3 years ago, we launched a multi-year effort to develop some perspectives coming out of the Great Recession on core economic issues. We don't have all the answers, obviously, and we're fundamentally not a policy shop, but we do think we have a fact base that can help bring to bear some information to help inform the national debate on how to drive growth and renewal after this difficult recession. It's worth mentioning that the report we're here to discuss today on U.S. economic game changers is the latest in a series of reports on topics related to the U.S. economy, including the role of U.S. multinationals, productivity, jobs, debt deleveraging, and cities. This research is also complemented by an impressive body of global perspectives, including recent reports on disruptive technologies, the future of manufacturing, and infrastructure productivity. This latest report, what we'll talk about today, explores the question of, is sluggish growth the new normal for the United States? As Steve said, some economists and analysts seem to think so. But we at the McKinsey Global Institute and McKinsey more broadly see tremendous potential upside for the United States. And I'd like to invite James and Susan to come to the stage to share what they've learned about launching our economy from this low, slow trajectory of recovery with limited job growth to new heights of reinvention and renewal. Before I do, as James and Susan join me here, let me give you a brief introduction to the two of them. James is the director of the McKinsey Global Institute and a senior partner who divides his time between McKinsey's San Francisco and Silicon Valley offices, working with many of the world's leading technology firms. He also leads a number of research efforts on business strategy issues as well as issues related to the global economy, particular focus on innovation, competitiveness, productivity and jobs, as well as technology and the impact on business and the economy. Some of his latest research efforts, including the ones I mentioned, are on disruptive technologies, the economic impact of the internet, big data, social media, and future of manufacturing, just small topics that James likes to dabble in. James hails from Zimbabwe via Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and was on the engineering faculty. He serves on numerous not-for-profit boards and is also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In January of this year, he was one of the 9 individuals appointed by the president to serve on the Global Development Council. So needless to say, we're pretty proud of you, James. Let me also introduce to my right and his right, Susan Lund, a principal at the McKinsey Global Institute based here in Washington. Susan's research focuses on the entire agenda of the Global Institute, but particularly on global financial markets, labor markets, and on economic growth. Recent reports that she led looked at the shifting pools of global wealth and the rise of emerging market investors, on the work on debt and deleveraging, prospects for the U.S. job creation and the future of work, and the long-term opportunities for African economies. Susan has a PhD in economics from Stanford, and prior to joining McKinsey, she worked extensively in developing economies, including the Philippines, Guinea, and rural China. So with that, let me hand it off to James and Susan to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Lenny, for that introduction, and thank you, Steve and CED, for hosting us. We're quite excited at the opportunity to be able to share some of our latest work on the U.S. economy. And I think in short order, Lenny, the answer to the question is is sluggish growth the new normal? I think we would say resounding, we don't think so, would be our response to that. I think it's quite easy to be in a pessimistic mode, and I think that's a lot of where our dialogues these days seem to be about the future of the U.S. economy and what's possible in terms of growth. And part of the impetus for us and the motivation is to try and change the tone of that conversation and start to think about what can we do to jumpstart the economy. So we're not sitting back and waiting, and I think, Steve, you're right. We try to think about how do we move the conversation forward. A lot of the conversation, again, at the moment is all about some of the fiscal issues, about monetary issues. While those are certainly important, and it's certainly important to think about the business cycle, we wanted to focus specifically on things in the real economy, what companies do, what work workers do, and what happens in sectors to try and reignite growth. And I'm always reminded, because it's always a good place to start, on this quote that we've got up here, which reads a lot like today's headlines, actually, if you think about it, except for the fact that this is actually something that was said by Keynes in 1930. And I think, it's no surprise that, you could have pulled this out of the newspapers today. And what we wanted to change about this is to have a different conversation. As I said, mostly focused on how can we think about reigniting growth. So here's what we did. We try to focus on the U.S. economy with a view to thinking about what are some game-changing opportunities that can take us to greater GDP growth, productivity, and job creation above the normal trend. So that was one consideration we took into account. We also tried to think about where do we have a window of opportunity of things that can be done now with a view to having real impact and real results by 2020 that we can start to see. And we also tried to focus on things that had a bit of a foundational aspect to them. In other words, you could see the benefits in multiple sectors across the economy. And that's how we got to the 5 opportunities that we've identified. The first one is shale energy. This is very much a topic of the day. We're talking a lot about it. But we think this is actually a tremendous opportunity and still has a lot of room to grow. So we'll go into that in some detail. Second, is the area around knowledge-intensive trade. It is quite striking that if you think about the narrative we typically tell ourselves about what happens in emerging economies in manufacturing trade and what happens in advanced economies, where we're supposed to, in advanced economies, capture the higher end of things, the R&D-intensive, knowledge-intensive activities. Well, that narrative is mostly true, except when it comes to the United States. We've had a deficit in terms of knowledge-intensive trade that we think is a real opportunity to turn that around and capture the opportunity. We'll talk about that. Third is big data and analytics. I think much of this has already started to happen in sectors like retail and financial services, but there are other big chunks of the economy, industrial, manufacturing, healthcare, the government, the public sector, and education, where there's tremendous productivity opportunities still from big data, and it's going to take real work to fully capture it, especially in the sectors that I just pointed to. Fourth, infrastructure investment and productivity. We've seen lots of numerous reports about the fact that the U.S. is lagging in its infrastructure. Well, it's actually true, but this also represents a real opportunity to actually invest in infrastructure in a way that will translate quite directly to GDP growth and also to jobs. We'll talk about that as well. And then finally, while talent and education and workforce development have been topics forever, we're now at a point in time where we think there's some real opportunities to do some quite different things to change the picture in a way that can yield real results by 2020. Lots of innovations underway, some that are technology-enabled, some are things that states and local governments are doing, but the opportunity is quite tremendous. So these are the 5 opportunities we're going to hear us talk about. This gives you a sense of the scale of the impact that we're talking about across these. As you can see, in the case that you've got, energy, for example, at the low end at 380 billion, all the way to 690 in terms of annual GDP contributions by 2020 above trend. And then you can see how these all rank up and stack. And in a lot of these, we've made, I think, fairly conservative assumptions. And we've also haven't factored in all the interactions, if you like, between the different game changes that we're talking about. But this is enough to convince us there's enough opportunity here to change the growth picture. And just to give you a quick mosaic of what this might look like, we were not just focused on GDP growth. We looked at the impacts of these in terms of, yes, impact on GDP, but also impact on productivity, impact and contributions to the trade balance, impact and contributions to, could this stimulate private investment? We looked at the impact on jobs. We also thought a lot about some of the societal, perhaps softer impacts in terms of how does this lay the foundation for future growth and development and competitiveness. So as we look at this, we're quite excited about the potential impact that these could have, again, above trend. This is not to say this is not going to take work. So just like with the language of game changers, just like these are likely to give us additional impact, they're also going to require real work, and that work is not just in government, but more importantly in the private sector and what state and local governments can do. And we'll also talk about that at the very end. Let me hand over at this stage to Susan, who's going to go through and give us a quick sense of some of the specific opportunities in each of these areas.
Thank you. I have, I think, 7 minutes to go through 5 game changers, so this is going to be a whirlwind. We'll start with shale production. What is this about? Well, over the last 5 years, shale gas extracted through hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling has grown at more than 50% per year. 5 years ago, hardly anyone was even talking about this, and today we have more natural gas than the US can use. The result, as you see on the right side of this slide, is that the price of natural gas in the United States has fallen to somewhere between $3 and $4 per million BTU, which is far below what it is in other countries. This chart shows you Japan and the UK as 2 other examples. This is creating a competitive advantage for the US, not just in terms of electricity prices, but also for the industries that use natural gas as a feedstock, so petrochemicals, resins, PVC, even steel. There's a steel plant being built in the United States today, a new steel plant, as a result of this shale energy boom. Potentially even bigger impact is the extraction of oil embedded in shale using these same technologies. As a result of that, the U.S. is importing less and less crude oil each year, and it's projected that the U.S. could actually become a larger oil producer than Saudi Arabia in the foreseeable future. All of this creates tremendous opportunity. By our estimate, if we fully capture the potential to continue expanding production of shale gas and oil, it could create up to 1.8 million jobs and add nearly $700 billion to U.S. GDP by 2020. Now, this isn't just in the oil and gas industry, although there is additional activity there, but this is downstream in manufacturing, particularly energy-intensive manufacturing. It affects the service sectors. Think about engineering design firms, accounting, legal services, and all the service industries that feed into manufacturing and oil and gas. And then there's an induced effect. So as we create more jobs, people are employed, they go out and spend on all sorts of things, from movies to food to healthcare. So the economic impact is felt across the economy. Now, to capture this, we fully recognize that we'll need to address some of the environmental risks. And in the report, we talk about what these are, some of the new technologies, and the importance of industry leaders themselves to get out ahead of this, to understand the risks, and then design well casings and drilling techniques to actually minimize the risks. If we don't do that, then of course we risk states and localities banning fracking altogether, and we wouldn't see this benefit. Moving on to knowledge-intensive manufacturing. As James explained, the U.S. is one of the only advanced economies in the world that doesn't run a trade surplus in these types of R&D-intensive goods that you would expect the U.S. to be competitive in. So what are these? Well, this is everything, including automotive, aircraft, other transportation, computers, electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals and petrochemicals, medical devices, optical equipment, basically all the innovative high-end products. Now, it didn't used to be this way. Back in the 1990s, you see that the U.S. overall trade position in these goods was roughly in balance, and over the last 15 years, it's deteriorated. There are a lot of factors that play into trade, including policy and the value of the dollar. What we did in this work is interview industry experts to look at very specific product categories to see, is there opportunity for the U.S. to improve its net trade position in these types of goods? And to give you one example of some of what we found, we think that there actually is a realistic chance, if the country puts its mind to it, to change this picture. Consider aircraft. Over the next 15 years, industry analysts project that the fleet of commercial aircraft around the world is going to double in size. And this is because of the growth of China, other Asian economies, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa. It's basically the emerging markets starting to fly around. Boeing is set to benefit from this, as well as Airbus. So simply by tapping into this global demand, we could see rising exports of aircraft. And indeed, in the last 3 years, you've seen a substantial increase in the number of aircraft, commercial aircraft, exported from the United States. The same rising tide of emerging market demand could benefit medical devices and other products. All in all, this is an important lever for the United States to get right. It feeds into the national manufacturing strategy, and we think that at a low scenario, the U.S. could at least reduce the size of this trade deficit to where it was in 2000, and possibly even close it altogether. If we were to do this, it would add nearly $600 billion to GDP and create up to 1.8 million jobs. And these are important jobs in that they're relatively high wage, would be important for the economy. The third game changer is big data. This is harnessing the vast quantities of data from social media, from consumer transactions, from sensors, videos, the web, weblogs, and being able to synthesize and analyze this data. We think that big data has the potential to transform sectors across the economy. And in the report sitting on your seat, we look at 4 sectors in particular: retail, manufacturing, healthcare, and government services, just to pick very different opportunities. Now, when people think about big data, you might think about targeted consumer marketing, so getting a coupon for a type of product that you like to buy. And that's one aspect of companies harnessing big data. But as an economist, the more important impact is actually on company productivity and efficiency. So it's how companies are starting to leverage this new found information to improve their supply chain and logistics, to improve their manufacturing processes, to improve sales and workforce targeting, to better understand consumer demand. And this raises productivity within companies, and then within the sector, and in the overall economy. So through this, we estimate that there's up to $325 billion in additional GDP by 2020, just from retail and manufacturing. And the manufacturing figure looks so much larger than retail simply because the retail sector is one of the furthest along and already starting to harness big data. Then when we look at the public sector and quasi-public sectors of healthcare and government services, there's equally large cost savings potential, and these have hardly been tapped yet. So there's a big potential for policymakers here. Our fourth game changer is infrastructure. It's not a secret that the U.S. has underinvested in the nation's infrastructure for many decades now. We did an analysis suggesting that the U.S. should be investing about 3.6% of GDP each year in infrastructure, and instead we're investing 2.6%. About 2/3 of that gap is in transportation, including rail, ports, airlines, and surface transportation systems. If we were to close this gap, it would mean an additional $150 billion invested per year in infrastructure. And in addition to investing more, it's important to invest it more wisely. So in studies that McKinsey's done around the world with infrastructure, we find that there's up to a 30% difference in the productivity or cost of a project. If you do it right, you prioritize projects, select them, design them, and execute them most efficiently than compared to the average. So there's an opportunity both to invest more and do it better. Now, overall, this has a big impact in the short term. It would be a stimulus to immediately get the economy moving, adding up to over $300 billion of GDP by 2020. And as in the slide that James showed you, the impact by 2030 is even larger, as then improved infrastructure enables other parts of the economy to be more productive. Finally, we've got the talent game changer. This chart shows you the U.S. tertiary educational attainment for the older cohort of Americans versus younger cohort. And quite simply, the U.S. used to be a leader in educating its people and getting folks into college. But for the younger generation, you see we've fallen way down the ranking as other countries have caught up. It's not so much that U.S. education has deteriorated, it just hasn't kept improving. And now there are many countries who send a larger share of the population into some form of tertiary education. Or consider the well-known lack of STEM degrees in the United States: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This chart shows you that 15% of four-year college degrees in the United States are awarded in these very important STEM fields that cover not just computer science, but things like engineering, mathematics, healthcare positions. That is far below the world average of 23%. It's below Mexico, 27%, far below the leaders in Asia. So there's an acute shortage, and we think that there's an opportunity there for the US to improve. Then finally, we look at the performance of K12 education in the United States. And it's long been known, but this chart is still shocking in what the data actually shows. So on an international test of 9th grade math performance, the United States ranked 31 out of 65 countries. It's below the OECD average and very far below the leading countries. This is quantitative view of what American students are learning versus what students in other countries are learning. Now, the good news is that both within the United States and in other countries, there are well-known policies and programs to turn all of this around, and it can be done within a decade. If we were to capture this, we think it's worth over $250 billion by 2020, and then the impact in the following decade is even larger as you get students with more learning, better cognitive development, go into post-secondary education, and then enter the labor force. And you get a lift-off effect on GDP worth well over $1 trillion by 2030. So these are the 5 reasons that we think that there is a significant opportunity if the US acts now to actually lift GDP growth, get out of this sluggish, low momentum recovery that we've been in.
Let me just close so we can get into our panel discussion with a few last comments. We think there's actually work to do for everybody here. For the private sector in terms of companies, for state and local government, but also for the federal government. But let me just start with some perspectives on business. There's a lot to be done in terms of just capturing the opportunities that we've talked about. In some sectors, this is already happening. Other sectors, not quite as much and as quickly as you might like. And also, you take into account the fact that there's still a lot of private capital that's still on the sidelines. So the more we can have the private sector start to invest into these areas and build new capabilities, there's a lot of work to be done. If you think about partnering, a lot of these areas actually require different new kinds of partnerships and collaborations, often between the private sector and the public sector, often different unusual partnerships even within the private sector itself, and we think that ought to be explored. The question of economic development, I think, should also be in the self-interest of private corporations, particularly when you think about issues of talent and other development. We think that should be on the agenda. It's also very, very important, though, to keep and remain mindful of the long-term risks and uncertainties. Certainly when you look at areas like big data, you look at areas like shale gas, there's still a lot more uncertainties and consideration that should be taken into account to issues like privacy, as well as to even considerations like the environment and what that might do to contamination and so forth. Let me touch quickly on, from a policymaker standpoint, well, we're certainly not prescriptive about policy. We do think it's important for these areas to be higher up on the agenda in terms of what gets a lot of attention and focus. We also think that it's important to take a bit of a tailored approach. If you could go across each of the 5 areas that Susan just went through, there are different roles that policy plays in different ones. There are several of these where policy can play a catalytic effect in terms of getting things started and getting things and attracting and inviting others to participate. There are other areas where, quite frankly, it's as much about getting out of the way and making things easy for the private sector to actually take initiatives and move forward. Then you've also got areas where it's important to establish the rules and create the right environment for the kind of private sector initiatives and investments to happen. So a bit of a tailored approach we think is quite important. And then I think we have to think about how policymakers can take bigger and bolder steps to be innovative and experiment a lot more. I think you're going to hear some of that from some of the panelists who are going to be on the stage. I know Tom's going to talk about some of the initiatives in that regard that are starting to take place. And then I think it's also important to think about, a lot of this happens at the local area. One of the things that Susan, I think, pointed to is that some of the most exciting innovations that we've seen are happening in cities, and they're happening in some states. The example that she didn't mention, perhaps should have, is that if you saw those test scores on the math scores, There are several states that have already innovated enough to actually reverse the trend. It's happened in Texas, happened in Massachusetts. So you're starting to see a lot of very exciting local and state level innovations that are starting to take place. At that point, let me hand back to Steve, who will probably take us into the next part of the agenda. Thank you.